Preface of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessica Louise. Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. Preface. Between these pages you will find only the good, old-fashioned, everyday cat. No Angora or thoroughbred has been entered here, unless it be Hansie, who is little more than mentioned. These are true incidents and true lives, with the exception of the one chapter, The Mission of the Cat. The reader will pardon the intrusion of Victor the dog. I have added him as the cook adds her trace of spice, but feeling also that he is entirely in place, being an ardent cat lover himself. End of preface. Chapter 1 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ginger. A tiny bunch of yellow fur, soft, silky, and warm, and huddled close against it 6 other wee bunches, not all yellow, but of various colours. Even the black lamb of the flock was there, his dusky coat very beautifully setting off the delicate buffs, greys, and whites of his companions. 7 baby cats, born in an upstairs closet, with a fine new fluffy feather boa for a nest. A happy little heap, truly, with nothing left to wish for. Such delicious warm milk to drink, such beautiful fur coats to wear, and as soft a bed to sleep upon as ever was pressed by human babe. But they thought nothing of all this. They simply snuggled up to their mother's warm body, blissfully content. They could not yet see her gentle countenance, radiant with the new love, nor could they see the kind faces of their human guardians as they looked down admiringly upon them. As is usual in cat families, the little band was soon broken. The brothers and sisters were scattered, sent away by those same guardians to bring happiness into other homes, each little kitty to win its own way in the world. The yellow or ginger-coloured one alone was chosen to remain under the paternal roof, to be the one comfort of his mother and the special care and delight of 2 ladies who had their rooms on the 2nd floor. These 2 I shall present to you as Ginger's sisters. Mothers, it might seem, by the care and devotion with which they ever surrounded him, but the feelings of the mamma cat must be respected. She might object to his having mothers other than herself, and sister is a pleasing term to many of us who are quite ready to claim relationship with our faithful 4-footed companions. They cling to us, no matter what befall, so long as we give them our love and care. 'Tis naught to them whether we be young or old, beautiful or ill-favoured, in rich attire or rags, so long as the heart is right, and a shanty is a palace if what they love is there. 'Tis true they are fond of luxury, but should the farmer's wife throw down a piece of sheepskin or folded bit of faded quilt in some warm and cosy corner, 'twould be luxury sufficient. I seldom went to Ginger's home in his early days that I did not hear the jingle of his golden bells as he scampered through the house, up and down the stairs, here, there, and everywhere, in his kittenish glee. The little life-spark burned very brightly in his small body, for never was kitten more frolicsome and fearless. How he would romp from end to end of the long parlour, up to the top of the lace curtains, and down again, never heeding the pinholes and rents that were left behind. A screen that was daintily robed in silk had to change her attire for white muslin, and finally for denim, that she might better resist the sharp little claws of her admirer. All cats are nosy, but young Ginger's curiosity bump was unusually well developed. No ornament was overlooked, no object, however small, escaped his keen scrutiny. One day he was making the tour of the mantel, upon one end of which was a bust, a female head, not life-size, but so nearly as to appear quite real, it also being slightly tinted to resemble life. Pussy went to it and eyed it closely, then raised up and put a paw on each bare shoulder, close to her fair plump neck, and then his face to her face. It looked so like a kiss and an embrace. "Surely a very cold little lady," said Ginger within himself. Then he inspected her hair. Whether he approved of the arrangement or not can never be known, but he seemed satisfied, and descended from the mantel. Ginger's sisters are busy women. Minds and hands are ever full, but the cat is one of them. He helps make up the home. A happy family of 3, in which the little furry brother is never neglected or forgotten. There is much that they could say that would give you a more perfect understanding of their pet's personality. As with most cats, the greatest charm lies with the heart rather than the head. 'Tis his wealth of affection, his dear caressing ways, that bind him so closely to his own. But he is also keenly intelligent. In his small yellow head there are no vacancies. No cat can better read and understand the changing human expression or tone of voice. Even the words themselves are frequently understood. And Ginger is an obedient cat, which is remarkable, most of his kind being aggravatingly independent in that direction. Upon one occasion he was lying, curled into a round ball, upon the lounge, sound asleep. A sister said to him in her ordinary tone, not calling him by name, "Do you want some kidney?" He opened his eyes wide and looked at her. She repeated the inquiry, when he immediately rose, reached up his paws to her in a long stretch, and then landed on her shoulder, going with her to procure the desired delicacy. Crab and corn are also words that bring a ready response, and his 3 names, Ginger, Boy, and Little Man, are always understood. His mother has the same quick ear and ready understanding. A certain medicine had to be administered to her occasionally, and well she knew its name. A step towards the closet where it was kept, and the mere mention of the drug were enough to send her to the door in unusual and undignified haste. Other drugs were in the same closet, and the same motions were gone through when in connection with them, but unless Puss heard the one dreaded word, she showed no signs of alarm or uneasiness. Ginger is not a robust cat. Sometimes he is so fragile that we long to be able to do something for him. He has been repeatedly coaxed to eat raw eggs, as some cats do, but no. Quite recently an egg was neglected, and left standing for nigh a month in a small cheese jar on the window sill. One of the anxious ones said to the cat one day, "Ginger, I do wish you would eat that egg. How I should love to buy you eggs by the dozen, if you would only eat them." The words were scarcely uttered, when the little man jumped to the sill, fumbled at the egg in the jar, then upset the whole thing, sending the egg to the floor with a crash and splatter. Down the cat jumped and licked up the egg with evident relish. Did Ginger understand? The 2 who know him best think that he did. Surely the month-old egg could not have been more acceptable to nostrils and palate than a fresh one would have been. When Ginger was a baby cat, just for the fun of it all, they fitted up a little basket for him. This was daintily lined, and contained a small brush and comb, toothbrush, soap, washcloths, and everything needful for the correct grooming of a cat. The hairbrush is to this day one of his greatest sources of pleasure. If he should be sunning himself on the low back roof, or snoozing, with one eye a crack open, in the cool grass below, and chance to see a brush being held at the second-story window, his own dear yellow-backed brush, up he gets, scrambles to the top of the board fence in a jiffy, from there to the roof and in through the window with a bound, where he may be seen a moment after revelling in the delights of an inspiring, invigorating rub-down. If the brush be stopped but for an instant, he reaches up with both paws, rubs his cheeks against the prickly bristles, and begs for more, more. As for the currying of his tail, that evidently strikes him as being a rather peculiar operation, a trifle ludicrous perhaps. He sits and watches the brush flying rapidly over his outstretched member, with a half-cat smile upon his countenance. Then, with a nervous twitch and wriggle of his back, he looks up at the power behind the brush, as if to say, "How much longer must this thing last?" Or perhaps, "There, there, that will do for this time." A peaceful, uneventful life has fallen to the lot of Ginger. Day has followed day, month after month gone by, and seasons rolled around, but the sheltering arms have preserved him, and fate has favoured him. Consequently, there are no hairbreadth escapes or daring feats of bravery to jot down in this little history. But he has had one fright that I know of, and that was when he was shut up, hard and fast, in the wardrobe. It was his overabundant curiosity, as usual, that led him into it, and before he could think of consequences, the door was shut and locked, and he was a prisoner. What should I do? He meowed and meowed again, but no one heard. Then, tired out, sat still and listened and waited. It was not for a very long time, but long enough perhaps for poor Ginger to wonder if he should ever taste of his beloved kidney again, or be nestled in the arms of his dear ones. Presently he heard a slight noise. Was it the rustle of a skirt? He meowed once more, putting his whole strength into his voice, and oh joy, he was heard. The key turned, the door opened, and he was gathered into the arms of love. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lambie. A Lover's Leap. Christopher Columbus, or Lambie, was a huge tiger cat, and Christopher was strong in battle, with the wild look of his kind still stamped upon his features. Those cousins of the plains and jungles seemed to look forth from his great yellow eyes. But his other nature was equally strong, such loving devotion, such faithfulness to the end. Lambkin Pie, a Yankee term of endearment, but usually cut short to Lambie, was his pet name. Lambie lived in a closely built section of the city where the houses sidle up to each other in very friendly fashion. From his chosen perches upon high points, the cat naturally saw much of what transpired about him, and no one could wonder that in the course of time he fell desperately in love with the wife of his nearest neighbour. His own home folk cared for him and were proud of him, but the light in Harriet's eye went deep into his heart, and it was to her he turned for the gentle caress and tender word. She understood so well his inner being, not only his love-longings, but the demands of the physical. Her delicious tidbits tickled his palate, and thus was Lambie led astray. Naturally a reserved and dignified cat, there was one time in each day when he was in a flurry of anxiety and expectancy. This was the early morning when he first heard the unloosing and lifting of a sash behind the closed shutters of Harriet's home. At which window was she? He must be sure to get to the right one, and be ready to bound in the moment the shutters were opened. One Christmas morning he heard her not at the window, so prowled about until he spied her in the upstairs sitting-room, he being upon the balcony. With frantic howls he sought admittance through the window, then plunged and beat against the door with all the strength of his full-grown cathood. Harriet went to the door and calmly told him to descend from the balcony and go to the kitchen door, that she would be there in a moment. The cat quietly obeyed, and soon they had their embraces as usual, he taking his morning ride upon her shoulder to the gate. There the milk bottles were taken up, and soon after came the saucer of warm milk, not entirely shorn of its cream. Happy and satisfied, he then seated himself upon the hearth, and superintended the preparation of breakfast. But his devotion did not end with a hearty meal. 'Twas Harriet's own dear self, after all. How he loved to lie across her bosom, her arms supporting him, his head and paws over her shoulder, always ready to go to those outstretched arms, and never ready to leave them for others. Such an invitation was usually acknowledged by a spiteful, discouraging little slap. His nights were spent at home, but his days were for her and hers. A friend who lived with her also received a share of his affection. Many times the final breakfast came from her hands. Then when through he would go with her to her rooms, knowing well that the comforts of the red leg, this was a portion of a piece of red flannel underclothing, would soon be his. Sometimes he was nervous and impatient until the bed was made and this article spread at the foot. But if there were a stretch of sunshine or a sprig of catnip to beguile the minutes, it was all right. Many delightful daydreams had Christopher upon his gay mattress, dreams of crisp young mice and tender birdlings, or Harriet with a bowl of steaming malted milk. He so loved this beverage that at Christmas time a small jar of the article was always found dangling from the limb of the tree. This was labelled "For Lambie," and old Chris never forgot his big puss. One of the family who was usually to be seen sitting listlessly here and there was Kate, a very large, old-fashioned doll baby. She could wear the dresses of a 3-year-old, and had quite a voluminous lap for a dolly. One day Lambie slept 3 hours long on this cold, unresponsive lap. He first twisted and turned, around and around, cat fashion, then looked up into her face and finally licked her rosy cheeks, but receiving no answering caress, settled down and was soon lost in slumber. The nap which caused the poor cat the most distress was his fly-paper nap. It did very well while he slept, but when he got up, he soon came to the conclusion that he did not care for such a hug-me-tight overcoat, so he dashed madly and recklessly about until part of it was jerked from him, along with some hairs. Then he sat down and licked at the rest. The end of it all was a desperately sick cat. Lambie had no love whatever for other cats. He seldom condescended to take much notice of them, but one day he saw a cat tiptoeing along the board fence with such an own-it-all air that it aroused the war spirit within him, and said he between his teeth, "I shall settle that cat once and for all, as my name is Christopher." The cat had not seen him, so he clambered up towards the top of the fence, then flattened himself as a hide against the boards, clutching the top with one paw only. There he waited, and the unsuspecting came on step by step, gaily balancing himself by his sinuous tail. But suddenly there was a hustle and a splutter, an unexpected shock, and an unlooked-for downfall. The fence-walking was given up for an indefinite period, and Christopher walked calmly into the house. Another time he attacked a cat on the porch roof, but this time the outcome was not so satisfactory. They tumbled off together then, gathering up their bruised bodies, each slunk off in the direction which best suited him. There was one puss who lived near by, whom Christopher made a practice of treating very shabbily. This cat was a handsome Maltese and a pampered darling of the family, but unfortunately something of a cripple and not able to climb fences and hoe his own row. He had his green grass plot and a little tent made on purpose to shelter him from the sun, but he liked the warmth of it, and as it slipped away from him he would go to the door and beg to have his tent moved. They always knew what was wanted, as he would go straight back and settle down again. Choice viands were given him, which usually attracted the ever-watchful eye of Lambie, and then poor Maltie's share was small. Our hero could conquer all cats, but he was as nothing when a turtle was around. Harriet had 2 pet turtles, and although Lambie was very jealous of them, he was finally taught to treat them with cool politeness, and the 3 would many times eat from the same platter. But whatever the elder turtle wanted he got, even though it be the tenderest bone from between the jaws of poor Lambie. One night Harriet was aroused from her slumbers by such mournful, distressed caterwauling that she raised her head from her pillow and listened. "That sounds like Lambie's voice," thought she, "but it surely cannot be, as he is always in the house at nights." but all through the long dark hours he kept it up, and at daybreak she looked from her window and saw her dear one sitting lonesome and forlorn upon the roof of a second-story bay window belonging to the house which backed up to them in the rear. Harriet went out upon the balcony, and Lambie saw her. Such wild and mighty cries of delight and petition never greeted her before. "Help me, I'm cold and hungry. Take me home." How the cat got there was never known. It was supposed that for a moment he forgot himself and slipped in from below. What enticed him he never told. One of his own family, the kitchen maid, who was fond of him, went for him. She called and coaxed him from the third-story window just above his head, but Harriet stood in her yard below, and he had eyes only for her. Before they thought it, he had made the leap from that dizzy height, and their hearts stood still. Down he came, but fortunately for him, an awning and a grape arbor somewhat eased the fall. As it was, he landed with a hard, cruel thud, but he gasped for an instant only, then pulled himself together, climbed the fence, and sank down at Harriet's feet. There he lay, slowly waving his tail and looking up into her face, saying as best he could with those glowing golden eyes, "I did this for you, all for you." She took the poor bruised and shattered fellow in her arms and carried him to the house. She fed and fondled him. She soothed the heated, swollen feet, but all day long he lay completely exhausted and undone, and for days there was no place for him but Harriet's lap. After this, the bond between them could be broken in but one way. They spent years of happy days together, but sickness and suffering came at length to Lambie, and Harriet mourns her lover. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 2 letters. Dictated by True, a fluffy Maltese kit. Dear Aunt Priscilla, these marks are my paw marks. I hope you reached New York safely. I often think of our long ride in the trolley car when you brought me to Mamma dear. I was so snug and warm inside your coat, but I could not see much for that queer white bag around me. I cried all day today until 3 o'clock. Mamma said she was most crazy. I don't see why, and she made so many queer faces when I tried to take a hand at the chicken she was preparing for dinner. I scratched her lily-white forehead, too, very badly. I wanted to sit on her top knot, but I slipped in getting there. I'm feeling so weak and miserable. Mamma says she has some medicine that will do me good. I hope it will not taste badly. I could not eat my milk tonight, and she fed me with a spoon. She said there was more ways than one of feeding a cat. At the supper table she upset a tumbler of water. You know, folks always blame everything on the cat, but as I was busy tickling her foot at the time, of course I was not to blame. If I were not writing to you, I would tell you I am fast asleep on Mamma dear's shoulder. Please write to your loving little True. From the Spirit Land. Dear Aunt Priscilla, Mamma received my letter from you today. I've been in the Spirit Land since Sunday afternoon. I get weaker and weaker, sicker and sicker. Everything was done for me to no avail. I could not chew, I could not swallow. Mamma fed me scalded milk with a spoon, but I did not enjoy it, neither did she. Finding I could not take the milk, she gave me malted milk, but that was very distasteful to me. They looked at my throat by the aid of a spoon, but I heard Mamma say she did not know how a cat's sore throat should look. Mine was a grayish-white. Well, as I said before, I am gone. I have no pain now. Sometimes I see Mamma dear reproaching herself for making me sleep those few nights in the outside kitchen. I may have taken cold, I cannot tell. I remember feeling very uncomfortable and shaking all over, but I don't want Mamma to feel badly, for afterwards, when it was colder, I slept all the nights in the kitchen. She was good to me, let me sleep on her shoulder in her pretty red shawl. She would pet and hold me all the time, and I know she often turns her head, and imagines she sees me again upon her shoulder, or feels my little body huddling up to her warm plump neck. If cats have spirits, mine is hovering around her still. Your own little True. These letters were handed to me by a friend. Not being intended for publication, I've had to make a few slight alterations, but the second letter is almost exactly as it was written to an absent member of the family. I knew Kitty True very well. A happy little life of a few weeks, and then came decline, the gradual slipping away, and the final void, the emptiness at our hearts. A dependent, loving little kitten, taken from us forever. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Cats by the Way, by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nigums. Nig, or Nigums as his fond mistress loved to call him, was a large coal-black cat with thick glossy fur and a tail unusually short and fluffy. He had a well-shaped head, with calm expressive countenance. No cat more conscious of his importance than he. Always dignified, straightforward, and above board. No sly tricks or petty meannesses for Nigums. He moved about from place to place with his mistress, and never made any attempts to return to his former homes. He loved his human friends devotedly. His mistress, Mrs. B., was his willing slave. Every night at bedtime Nig was put out of the house, and just as regularly he would climb to the porch roof very early in the morning, from 4 to 5 usually, and knock at Mrs. B.'s window, which opened out on the roof. This knocking was done by pulling back and forth the narrow strip which held the sash, a nail or two being missing. Mrs. B. would always hear and let him in. If wet from rain or snow, he would not leave her until wiped off with a towel. Then he would hasten to the kitchen and get his early morning breakfast, which was always left in a saucer under the stove. Everything had to be of the best for him, cream or perfectly sweet, rich milk, and the freshest of meats cut into small pieces. When through with this meal, he would return to Mrs. B.'s room and cuddle down in her feather bed for a good sleep, which sometimes lasted until noon if not disturbed. Nig's dances always caused much amusement. When on a cane-seat chair, Mrs. B.'s son would take the opportunity to tickle his feet from underneath. Puss rather liked this for a time, and would lift up first one foot and then another in rapid succession, at the same time watching the hand underneath with a curious, intent expression. But his nerves would finally give out, and he would leap to the floor and dash out of the house, or as far away as possible. The first time he was moved, he was so suspicious of the basket that he bit at it, scratched, and flustered around until Mrs. B.'s patience was almost exhausted. But after 2 or 3 movings he seemed to understand, and the last time, as soon as she got him to the new house, she hastily unfastened and lifted the lid, thinking he would be in a hurry to get out, but he lay there contentedly blinking and seeming to say, "This is very comfortable, the basket just fits. Do I have to get out?" After his last move, the family was increased, and Mrs. B. sometimes remarked that Nigums wasn't quite so devoted to her as he had been. But when old age and sickness came, then he remembered his first and dearest friend. It was to her rooms upon the 3rd floor that he crept laboriously, and there laid himself down in his last illness. For 2 weeks she nursed and watched over him, then, just at the last, there came a spurt of the old ambition. He crawled downstairs and out into the backyard, then foolishly made the attempt to climb once more to the top of the board fence. But he fell, and the coloured woman, seeing him, gathered him into her apron and carried him back to his haven of rest. Years have gone by, and Mrs. B. still mourns, knowing well that another cat could never be to her what he has been. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Cats by the Way, by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mayen. Sally Brass was the first of the race to dwell in that garden home upon the hill. Flowers, flowers everywhere, beds, borders, and billows of flowers, and the graceful hillside sloping down until it banks the cool, shadowy waters of Darby Creek. Perhaps Sally did not appreciate these beauties. Be that as it may, her days were few upon the hill. She disappeared, and nothing more was known. But a daughter was left behind, who was nameless for a time, but afterwards answered to Coldie, not because of a cold heart, far from it, but from the habit, although well fed at home, of regularly appearing at the kitchen door of a near neighbour, to beg for food, for cold victuals, said the neighbour's son. Poor Coldie's life was short also. Death claimed her at the jaws of cruel dogs. Again a kit was left behind, and this was Mary Ann, or Mayan for short, a name which she carried honourably for 10 long years. Whether the manner of her mother's death left a lasting impression upon Mayan's mind we cannot say, but we have never known a cat more brave and persistent in battle with dogs. She never slips away even when opportunity offers, but seeks rather than shuns, and invariably comes out victorious. Her tactic is surprise. Before the dog fully realizes that there is a cat in near proximity, the fierce creature is upon him, hissing, spitting, and biting, raking her sharp claws into his flesh until he is so crazed with the pain that he takes himself off as fast as 4 bleeding legs can carry him. The cat has been known to attack 3 dogs at once, sending them all yelping away in the twinkling of an eye. But Mayan is getting old, and we tremble for her, lest some day her daring bring suffering or death. Now for the domestic Mary Ann, dear old puss, so lovable, so devotedly attached to her invalid master and to his wife while she lived. Some years ago the former was confined to his bed the greater part of the time. The cat seemed to think it her special duty and pleasure to sympathize with and care for him. Her favourite place was upon his breast, where she would lie and gaze lovingly into his face. Offerings of mice were brought and dropped upon or quite near him, he feeling sure that she intended and was anxious for him to eat them. Occasionally she brought a live one, but this was rather unnerving. They were brought in greater numbers after kittens had been taken from her. She seemed then to be overflowing with love, and wished him to be the recipient. Mayan is a hunter, and very early began to bring in rabbits almost as large as herself, field mice, far more delicious than the home mice, and the gay little birds from the boughs. The rabbits and birds were always taken from her, hoping thereby to teach her to leave them unmolested. Whether it had any effect or not we scarcely knew, but she soon ceased bringing them to the house, and among all her offerings to her beloved sick never was there bird or bunny. Mayan is fair and graceful. Hers are the pastel tints, white with delicate buffs and pearly greys. Her eyes are large, expressive, and unusually dark for a cat. When last I saw her, she had one plump, fluffy kitten nestled close in her embrace. It had the well-formed head of its mother, and her colours without the grey. Pure white, with buff on head and back. Its round baby eyes were opened wide in wonder. Both were immaculate, as pretty a pair as ever was seen. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Poor old Tom. A baby country girl, little more than a year old, sat upon an outspread quilt in front of the open door. She was very busy playing with some red and white corn cobs, when a large, beautiful cat came to the door and peeped in. Evidently liking the looks of the little maid, he ventured farther, and soon joined with vim in the corn-cob game, rolling and tossing them about to baby's great delight. The cat was a stranger, a stray who had been seen lingering about the barn for some little time. He longed, no doubt, for human companionship, but was afraid to venture until the innocent baby voice reached his ear. That babe has now reached middle life. Grey hairs crown her head and frame her sweet, bright face. The cat's instincts were true, for lovable she has been throughout her life. A rare babe and a rare cat. From whence he came they never knew. Well bred he was, and handsome, remarkable for his size and afterwards for length of life. His colour a soft Maltese grey, with white upon his breast. Day after day the cat returned to play with his chosen friend, and the two became devotedly attached. But it was a friendship that had to be broken, for baby was only a visitor, and mamma and papa wanted their little girl again. But the childless uncle and auntie also pined for the baby girl, and the parents, having other little folks about them, yielded her once more. This visit, however, proved to be a long one. From weeks it lengthened into months and years, and ever after the home was at uncle's. Tom soon renewed his old intimacy, faithful lover that he was, and the two were very happy, the close companionship continuing throughout Tom's life. He and the dear uncle would always see the little maid through the wood, halfway to school, and then would meet her again when studies were over. At home they played together and rested together. As Tom grew older, he became a trifle childish, and had to be humoured in some things. He had the habit of coming to the front hall door quite early in the morning, summer and winter alike. Little Hannah would hear his beseeching voice and hasten down to let him in. In winter she would patter down with small bare feet, though cold and dark, open the great door a crack, seize the big puss in her arms, and fly like a tiny ghost to her bedroom. Safely inside, she would quickly slip the bolt, then climb with her burden into the great feather bed, where the two would snuggle down together for a sound morning nap. But naughty puss would take advantage of her kindness, and occasionally was known to come to the door as early as 2 o'clock in the morning. Poor old Tom! One day he was found disabled underneath a pile of rails. Shaken by dogs was the supposition. It might have been paralysis, but it was a terrible thing to his lifelong friend, the little girl who had now reached womanhood. Tenderly they carried him to the front yard and made him a soft bed beneath a shady tree, but his hours were numbered, and that day was his last. Many times has she said to me, "That was one of the greatest griefs of my life." Uncle made the coffin, and faithful Tom was laid to rest in a corner of the front yard. A stone and a rose-bush were planted at his head. They both remain to this day. The rose has grown large and strong-limbed, bearing each spring its crown of rich red bloom. The following quaint epitaph was composed by an old gentleman, a near neighbour and intimate friend of the uncle. Poor Tom is gone, his race is run. He died just aged 21. An age not reached by many cats who live by catching mice and rats. By Hannah he was daily fed from bounteous store of milk and bread, and by her kind and gentle ways thus adding to his length of days. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Cats by the Way. Having made my home for a time in the city, it has been my great pleasure to spy out all the cats by the way. The side entrance and alley cats, the roof and fence cats, and others innumerable. About dusk these creatures become restless. The wild spirit of the night seizes them, they long to roam, and anyone on the lookout may see them slipping quickly and noiselessly about, or peering cautiously with wide-open eyes from dusky corners and cubby-holes. Their time has not yet come. A little later, when the streets are comparatively quiet, they will go boldly forth into the night. My street acquaintances are exceedingly interesting. As a whole, they are wise and keen-witted, foxy, but most of them, I find, love the gentle caress, the rub under the chin quite as well as other cats. There often has to be a little wooing first, some honeyed words and a pleasant smile to reassure. There is a black and white cat who sits in the doorway of the candy kitchen and meows continuously in a high, cracked voice so long as I even glance her way. And there is the corner grocery cat, a handsome fellow, who plays with the pigeons and sparrows. He has never been known to catch one, and apparently does not expect such good fortune. He loves the fun, however, of creeping up upon them and hearing the sudden whir of their wings. He was a stray kitten originally, but is now a great favourite among the store clerks, who have supplied him with quite a handsome collar. Then there is the very homely cat, who sits just outside the iron side gate of a residence on M Street. She is of yellowish brown and black, one half her face being of the one colour and the other half of the other. This gives her a very grotesque appearance, but she is always extremely friendly, and probably thinks herself the most beautiful cat on the street. There are usually in the backyard 2 more cats, quite similar in appearance, but I feel certain that it is always the same cat that greets me at the front. At a nearby bakery is a most beautiful Angora with the softest fur I ever laid my hand upon. In the evenings of warm days he may be seen stretched at length on the doorstep. He does not object to caresses, but accepts them quite indifferently. "What is his name?" I inquired one evening. "Hans," she said. "Hansie, we call him." Then there is a very clean little cat who disappears through a small square hole in a board fence on B Street. Such a pretty combination of white and rich dark yellow, all white but back, tail and cap over the ears. She pauses a moment and looks up at me with that affectionate blink or squint which most cats can command, then scrambles into the hole, always too soon, for I love to look at her. But the lady fair is timid. One day I spied a kitten and its mother underneath a fruit stand. Picking up the kitty, I rested it on top of a pyramid of oranges, that I might get a better look, but the woman at the end of the stand glowered so black upon me that I hastily returned the babe to its mother and went upon my way. The fountain cat haunted the public square in the early spring, in quest of sparrows, I suppose. The fountain was not playing then, and the oblong hole at the base was her favourite retreat when annoyed by troublesome children or rude dogs. There she was doubly safe, as an iron fence surrounds it. The cross-eyed cat on the avenue has won my heart because of her gentle, motherly countenance, and the mud or clay-coloured cat on M Street is the only one of that shade that I have ever seen. Mother Nature meant to have a yellow cat, no doubt, but ran short of yellow ochre, or whatever pigment she made use of. There lurks at times an enticing spirit even in the midday air, something unseen and undefinable. It is not always temperature, neither is it sunshine or shade. Sometimes I have been on the go for hours and not been favoured with a glimpse of a cat, not even the tip end of a disappearing tail. At other times they were everywhere, in the street, on doorsteps, gazing out of windows, and making themselves conspicuous in both usual and unusual places. The bulk or show-window cats are very numerous. They seek the light and sunshine, and they love to watch the goings-on of the street. But cats do not always look in place in the windows. Sometimes they are curled up on ladies' finery, and occasionally there are confections or other eatables in close contact. One day I tapped on the window at a little black imp curled up on a roll of matting. He roused from his slumbers and looked around and above me, but strange to say could not see me at all. The light, I suppose, attracted yet blinded him. I tapped again, but still he would not look at me in the eye, only a vacant glance, as if I was naught but a great shadow. Perhaps pussy was daft or dim-visioned. There is one cat who comes up before me continually, before my physical eye and my mind's eye. 'Tis White-Face, the tramp cat who roams the streets in the section where I live. Such a scratched and soiled white face! It is such a sneaky, thievish, wicked countenance! I sometimes think if there are escaped criminals among cats, he must be one. Alas, that he should seem to be a follower of mine! Many times I involuntarily look behind me, and there is his ragged, dusky, grey form but a few paces behind. Or if I see a grotesque form ahead, halted with head in air or crouched in the shadow, it always proves to be his. Has the poor sinner any friends, or does he steal his living from day to day? I have heard there was a doctor lady who sometimes slipped him cold bites, but I think she has gone away. Last of all, there are the two black and white cats who sit one on each end of the little bench in the yard opposite. I have never seen them sitting close together or seeming at all affectionate with each other. Yet surely they are devoted, for one never leaves without the other. If Jack drops to the ground and walks off, Jill peeps around and soon follows after. But these two and their friends are not so interesting at night. Many a time I've been suddenly aroused from sound sleep by their heart-piercing cries, such wild, unearthly shrieks, and such mournful, misery-laden mutterings that I have lain in my bed shivering, and wondering if in my heart of hearts I truly loved cats. But with the night my bitter, revengeful feelings vanish, the cold creeps disappear. The morning sun brings love once more, and as I stand at my window and look down upon the great wall with its stone cap, I realize what a grand place it must be for moonlight strolls and midnight concerts. I said last, but then comes up before me the museum cat, the handsome tiger puss who lives there month after month among the gruesome relics, apparently well content. We went one day to this place. We devoted hours to the interesting but depressing things therein contained. Such horrible haunting mummies, wide-eyed skulls, and clattering skeletons, pictures of ferocious natives, hideous little images, and unprepossessing gods and idols. Everything dead, and old, ages old. We would not have missed it for the world, but when we suddenly came upon a real live cat, curled up upon a pedestal, we involuntarily bowed down and worshipped. We put our arms about him, we buried our faces in his fur. What a dear and wonderful thing life is, after all. But Tiger was sleepy, so we left him, little dreaming what pleasure and rest he had given us. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Country Catkin. Tom Tab, Tom Tan, Snowdrop, and Violet. Extract from a letter. Whenever I milk Daisy, Tommy Tan sits on his hind paws and swallows the milk as fast as I can fire it into his mouth. He always sits 2 or 3 yards away on the opposite side of the cow. When taking my walks, he accompanies me, but has a way of running ahead several rods, and hiding in the bushes until I get past, then jumping up and running ahead again. Sometimes I pick him up, and he stretches out across my shoulders and wraps his tail around my neck, making a complete muffler of himself. Tom Tan also brings live lizards and drops them in my lap. There's usually a stampede about that time. One time Snowdrop warned me that the kitchen roof was on fire by walking towards the stove, then looking up at the roof and mewing most dismally. Another time I made a big fire in the stove, turned up the damper, and went upstairs while the oven was heating. In a few minutes I heard a tremendous racket, and just as I reached the kitchen the oven door flew open, and out tumbled poor Snowdrop in a pitiable plight. Feet were blistered, fur was singed, and Kitty was badly frightened. He soon recovered, however, but had the misfortune to meet with another accident not long after. He inadvertently stepped into a steel trap and had a very sore paw in consequence. Had I not discovered and released him very soon, matters would have been much worse. Tom Tab is the most affectionate fellow, and prefers lying in my lap to romping with the others. He puts his paws around my neck, and touches with his nose first one cheek and then the other, purring loudly all the time. Tom Tab also had an escape. He was chased quite a distance by hounds. They caught him just outside the yard. I heard the noise and ran out just in time to save my cat. He was nearly killed, and I thought for days that he could not get well, but nature and nursing did wonders. Both Toms are good catchers. When I throw them bits of bread, Tan stands on his hind legs and catches them with his paws, putting them to his mouth before sitting down. Tab does not go to all that trouble, but simply catches them in his mouth. Both cats touch my elbow at meal-times if they want anything. I used to feed my cats out of doors upon a high shelf, so the dogs and chickens could not get their food. Violet, the Maltese kitten, could not climb to the shelf like the full-grown cats, so she used to climb up my skirt, then up to my shoulders, and to the top of my head, by way of my hair, from there across to the shelf or dining-room. My cats always seem to me to be brighter than other people's. Perhaps it is because I make such companions of them. I love them dearly, and wish that I might have a regiment of cats and kittens. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nero. I went one day to the home of Nero. So much had been told me by a mutual friend of the accomplishments of this cat, that I felt myself quite ready to fall at his feet and adore. An intelligent and affectionate cat suggests at once something soft and fluffy, pretty and plump, with gentle, alluring countenance. It so happened that Nero's appearance had never been described to me, so on this particular day I calmly awaited the handsome creature that would likely soon appear. They told me that if he were in the yard he would come to the back parlour door and rattle the knob, but that he could not open the door, as it had the habit of sticking. If no one answered the call, he would go to a window and sit and wave a paw, as a baby does in shaking Day-Day. Should the cat come from the kitchen or any other part of the house, he would without difficulty turn the knob of the door leading from the hall to parlour and admit himself. So we sat and chattered, and quite soon there came the rattle at the hall door, a rattle which by its vigour suggested a dog rather than a cat. The door opened, and in walked, alas for my dreams, such a cat! Tall, gaunt, bow-legged, peak-faced, and with what seemed almost an evil glitter in his green-yellow eyes. Could I touch him? Dare I touch him? It seemed to me he was a cat one might dread to meet in the dark. I smothered my feelings with a mighty effort, and for politeness' sake made a weak attempt at caressing. Poor old Nero was an idol, a very king in the house, and I could not say a word. He really was and is a wonderful pussy-cat, and even before that call was ended my feelings changed towards him. He is a cat that is head and shoulders above the average, remarkable for his dexterity and keen intelligence, also for his faithful devotion to mistress and friends. Nero loves crackers. After we had fussed over him for a time, my friend suggested that a cracker be brought him. This they crumpled upon a newspaper and put on the floor for him. At the last, a few scattered crumbs were left, and as he did not wish to miss any, he put his deft right paw under each corner in turn, and shifted them to the centre. Then the last little heap was licked up and enjoyed. Next best to crackers, Nero likes a fight. At least he is fond of boxing. A young man of the household enjoys it as much as he. The cat stands on his hind legs, goes at him right and left with great energy, and with a very murderous look upon his face. But it is all put on, for it is simply play after all. The moment his combatant drops his hand or holds it motionless before him, the fight is over, and his whole manner changes. Then he fawns, rubbing and winding around the legs of his foe in a most affectionate way, either begging his pardon or asking for another skirmish. Adieu, old Nero. Long may you live to be a joy to your kind mistress, and forgive me, please, for some of the sentences here written. Had fate but favoured me with even a few days of your intelligent companionship, this history would have been longer, and so full of your virtues and accomplishments that all else would have been forgotten. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Brassie. He wandered to the door of a farmhouse among the Chester County hills of Pennsylvania. Mrs. L., speaking of him, said he was the ugliest cat she had ever seen, a sad mixture of rusty black and dusty brown. But her kind heart took him in, and her willing hand cared for him. He soon acquired the habit of climbing to her shoulder, and making love to her from that vantage ground. One day she was standing talking to her husband, with one hand hanging beside her, when the cat started as usual to clamber to her shoulder, but instead of catching to her clothing, the sharp claws of one paw sank into the flesh of her hand, causing the blood to start and resulting in quite a deep wound. In her pain she shook him off, but knowing it to be purely accidental, did not scold him. The husband said, "Oh, Brassie, see what you have done to Mamma's hand!" The cat slunk off under the stove and finally to the barn, and for days acted as though he were sick, eating almost nothing. Continual coaxing and petting at length brought him back to his former abode, but from that day to this, a year or more, he has made no attempt to mount to his old station on Mrs. L.'s shoulder. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chapter 11 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cats of the Y Family. Part 1. A mother cat and her two kittens, Ruby and Pearl, were members of this family a number of years ago. Little Pearl did not live, but Ruby grew in stature, strength, and beauty, and became a treasure indeed, more precious perhaps to some of the family than the real red stone would have been. Ruby was still in his kittenhood when his mother one day laid at his feet some brand-new brothers and sisters, little sprawling, crawling things, with tiny pink paws and no eyes at all, so far as he could see. But no jealous pangs disturbed his bosom. He seemed immediately to feel that it was the elder brother's part to tend and care for them. And so devoted was he that a call to breakfast, dinner, or supper would not cause him to stir if the baby brothers and sisters were pillowed on his breast. One kitten was kept and named Tippy. The mother and other kittens were disposed of. Enough said. So Ruby and Tippy grew up together, both intelligent cats and dearly loved by the family. Ruby was a handsome black and white fellow, quite oddly marked. A little girl in the family took a great interest in him and taught him many tricks. Tippy was her devoted follower. Upstairs or downstairs, wherever she went, Tippy was by her side, a quiet, faithful, warm-hearted little companion. About this time the Y family began to build themselves a new home. 'Twas across one small field, a stone's throw, and every time the women-folk visited this new building, Ruby and Tippy went along. Finally the moving day came, and the cats went with them and were fed there, but they soon grew restless and scampered back to the dear old home. How desolate it must have seemed to them! The next day they went again to the new home and were fed, but could not stay. These daily pilgrimages continued for nearly a week. Then they seemed to reconsider, and finally concluded that where the Y family ate, drank, and slept was surely the proper place for Ruby and Tippy. Then there was another moving day, but this time it was only the cats, and they hadn't much luggage. One day Tippy had some babies born to her, and she was very young. She had no mother to tell her how to manage and care for them, and sometimes her instinct failed her. The wee things were being exhibited one day to some parlour guests, and it worried Tippy greatly. She must get them away, but how? She grabbed one by the tail, but such a racket as it set up, and such a squirming! That would never do, so she dropped it and tried another the same way. It behaved quite as badly. She was in a dilemma. But the family took pity upon her, and carried the babies back to their nest. Ruby and Tippy lived happily for some years, but there came a reign of terror. Some fierce dogs were quartered in the neighbourhood. Beautiful Ruby was run down first, and poor Tippy soon followed. She had 2 little kittens to defend, and could not save herself. They were rescued, but the bloodthirsty beasts finally got one of them. The other one was put in the cellar, where it too found its enemy, a rat, it was supposed, for the next morning its little body was found lifeless and bleeding. And that was the end of the race, and great was the distress in the Y family. Part 2. In course of time the rats and mice multiplied, and the cat-lovers of the family were desolate, so they drove one morning a mile or more to neighbour P.'s, and begged for a cat or kitten. A wee rusty brown kitten was given them, and as Princess Bonnie was then popular, the name of Bonnie was bestowed upon the new member. The little fellow soon put off his dusty brown coat, and came forth in glossy black, at the same time growing beautiful in form and feature. A brave little hunter was he, for he brought in a half-grown rat before he was well out of dresses. But the pests had gained such headway that one pair of baby paws could not level them down. So they journeyed again to neighbour P.'s, and said, "Please give us an older cat," and they willingly handed forth Molty, who was Bonnie's grandmother. Then they drove home rejoicing. But alas! In a short time Molty disappeared, and the rats still ran riot. A third cat was then solicited, and this time it was Bonnie's own mother, Jill. And Jill soon found her mother Molty, who was in the hay-mow making love to 2 or 3 newborn kittens. So the 3 generations roamed about by night and by day, and the rats and mice vanished. But Jill took to chicken-stealing, and that ended her life's history. And Molty disappeared again, stolen it was believed, for she was never heard from more. But full-grown Bonnie, the persistent hunter, was all sufficient now. So Bonnie reigned and still reigns over the Y homestead. Bonnie can carry a little Japanese teapot by the handle to amuse the guests of the Y family, unless there be strange gentlemen present. Bonnie can steal tomatoes and devour them greedily. To him they are the most delicious of vegetables. Bonnie can also sleep contentedly and comfortably on a lady's best bonnet. He has no love for strangers, and seems to have a real dread of all men outside his own family. One evening he was sleeping upon his favourite sofa, when men and women began to come into the room, it seemed to him from everywhere, for by the time he was thoroughly aroused he was surrounded, and one dreadful man was sitting right alongside him on the sofa. He could not put up with that for a moment, so down he jumped and walked majestically out of the room. Upon the table in the adjoining room he saw some new, soft, pretty-looking things which needed to be examined more closely, so up he got and began his investigation. One of the bonnets, for such they were, pleased him mightily. He could not leave it, so he made his bed upon it, and settled down for another good catnap. When the meeting broke up, and the ladies came for their wraps, one little woman looked somewhat crestfallen, but she bore up bravely, happening to be a cat-lover. One member of the Y family lives in the sunny south. He returns but seldom to the home of his parents, and it so happened that Bonnie was a grown cat when this son one day walked in. Strange to say, instinct, sight, or smell told him that this was one of the family, and he showed no signs of fear or even shyness. After a few years of uninterrupted happiness and freedom, poor Bonnie took up with bad company. A near neighbour had a cat who stole young chickens. Bonnie's mother also having had that weakness, the 2 influences brought to bear upon him were too much, and a bloodthirsty thief he became. Great was the sorrow and perplexity of the family when this horrible destructive habit was discovered. What should they do? Some said give him away. Others even threatened a more final cure, but he had so gained upon their affections that they could do neither. It ended in his imprisonment every spring for a number of weeks while the chicks were small. His prison was the cellar. Poor misguided cat, to give up the green grass and the sunshine all through the glorious springtime for the sake of a few stolen mouthfuls. But he has his nights when he is set loose for exercise and fresh air, and, like the good dutiful cat that he is, every morning early he returns to take his accustomed place behind the prison bars. Pussy-cat Land. Lullaby. Oh, the mewing and purring, the nestling and nursing, the laving and loving in Pussy-cat Land, in cuddly, coddly Pussy-cat Land. Oh, the racing and chasing, the frisking and whisking, the hustling and tussling in Pussy-cat Land, in frolicsome, rollicksome Pussy-cat Land. Oh, the grumbling and tumbling, the shifting and shoving, the scrapping and slapping in Pussy-cat Land, in wranglesome, janglesome Pussy-cat Land. Oh, the waiting and watching, the creeping and catching, the sneaking and snatching in Pussy-cat Land, in murderous mouse-eating Pussy-cat Land. Oh, the winking and blinking, the nodding and napping, the peeping and sleeping in Pussy-cat Land, in slumberous, troubleless Pussy-cat Land. End of chapter 11. Recording by Jessica Louise, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Chapter 12 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Glen, Gale, and Victor. 2 cats and a dog. Glen and Gale are brothers and live on a farm in southern Indiana, but sad to relate, like many human brothers, they are far from being congenial, and but for the amiable, forgiving spirit of Glen, I do not think the same house or farm would have helped them as this has done for a number of years. Their names fairly represent them. Glen, with his peaceful, quiet disposition and attractive appearance, white face, pink nose, white shirt front, and long white gloves and hose, drab coat and cap. The most affectionate cat I've ever known, as he is always ready to give and receive caresses, no matter where or when accosted. Most cats have their moods, and at times do not care to be hindered or disturbed by love-making. Glen's most soothing delight is to rub his face and head against the chins of the young men of the family, the slight roughness being very agreeable to him. Gale is a pretty cat also, a Maltese grey, with no white, and notwithstanding his very nervous, uncertain disposition and crabbed countenance, I am truly fond of him. Rarely, very rarely, does he care for the caress, but occasionally seeks it, and then is very sweet and charming. Poor fellow, he has a high temper to battle with, and we wonder sometimes if he does not feel a wee mite sorry after he has soundly boxed poor Glen's unoffending ears, or plunged his claws unceremoniously into Victor's innocent fat sides. For Victor is the most gentlemanly, considerate dog, as far as cats are concerned, that it has ever been my lot to know. He and Glen are very fond of each other. They take their naps huddled up into one heap, or stretched out together by the roaring wood fire. Many a time I have seen Victor hurry out to meet Glen when he has seen him returning across the fields from a morning hunt. They kiss or touch noses. Then Glen rubs and winds round Victor's short brown legs, purring out his little love words all the time. When the glad meeting is over, they return to the house together. Both cats are great hunters on the farm, but think it quite beneath them to interfere in any way with the house mice. These come and go at will. They nibble and gnaw, with never a cat's paw raised against them. 'Tis the young rabbits, the birds, and the field mice that tickle the palates of Glen and Gale. The brothers are alike in seeking unusual, out-of-the-way places for their naps. If a closet door be left open, that is fine. If it happen to be a cupboard for china or table linen, 'tis luck indeed, for linen makes a soft, cool bed, and even china is not objectionable on a hot summer day, as it always presents a cool surface. They love to stretch themselves on beds or bureaus. An open trunk has seemed particularly inviting to Gale. Glen likes to sit on the clock shelf immediately in front of the clock. He often sits there for a long time, cocking his head on one side and gazing about him with a high and mighty air. But the dearest place of all, when they long for a good, sound, uninterrupted sleep, is in the attic. Nothing to disturb then but the buzzing of the wasps and mud daubers, or the clatter of birds' claws on the roof. A trap door admits them to this attic, but all too seldom is it left open, so they think, for we have often seen them looking longingly towards it when closed. Let us hope that it will never be shut with poor pussies within, for they would have to speak up very loudly for their liberty. Glen, Gale, and Victor drink their milk from the same dish, but Victor's great cuppy tongue rapidly makes way with it, and the cats are left hungry. Gale frequently looks out for this, and uses the before-mentioned clause to very good advantage, so that a part at least of the meal is reserved for himself and brother, although the brother also is quite often ordered to step back and leave room for his betters at the feast. A few words more must be said of Victor, for he is such a dear dog. Good-natured, affectionate, and intelligent, a dog with a very sweet tooth. He loves above all things cookies, candy, sugar, preserves, or even a piece of well-sweetened pie, if tucked into his mouth point foremost, will send him off with a happy wag of his stumpy tail to enjoy it in the cool grass without. But cookies, that is the one word in the English language for him. One corner of the dining room is known as Cookie Corner. We say, "Cookie," and he flies to this spot, and sits there meekly, but with very bright, expectant eyes, his fat body squeezed tight into the corner. As soon as the cookie is in sight, he bounds into the nearest chair, sits up, and speaks before he receives the delicious sweet. At first his voice is husky from excitement, but he has to quiet his nerves and speak out clearly before the cookie is his. His fondness for such things being well known, his friends both far and near remember him. A little girl in a nearby town always comes laden with her bag of cakes and candy for Victor, and candy has travelled by mail from Pennsylvania afar to fall into his ever-ready jaws. But the dog works well for his wage. He is a faithful, watchful attendant, and a fine hunter. We have known him to keep going until he was almost ready to die from heat and exhaustion. We have hung over him with our big palm-leaf fans, and have wet his wrists and head with cooling water, not knowing what the end might be. His fat is very much against him. That, I suppose, is the result of his sweet tooth. Above all sports he delights in ball-playing, and I never saw his equal among dogs. He has his own ball, and is always anxious for a game, seldom missing a catch, no matter in what way the ball may be thrown. Victor has always associated with cats more than with dogs, and as he hobnobs so beautifully with them, I have sometimes wondered if he does not think that he himself is a fine big cat. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Willie, or Smut-Face. One of the kittens of my childhood was a pretty, spotted fellow, but with an ugly brown patch on his nose. Quite early in his kittenhood he was afflicted with those enterprising little backbiters, fleas. We children concluded to clip him. This was done leaving the fluffy head and the paintbrush tail, and we were quite proud of our baby lion. But one day we missed him. Our darling was gone. I do not remember the length of time that he was missing, but we had about given him up as stolen or killed, when one morning we heard the faintest little meow. Was it an echo, a daydream, or only a trick of the wind? We held our breaths and listened. Yes, it must be, but so far, far away it sounded, and yet so near. We glanced up the tall maple tree that stood beside us, but saw no little white kitty. We examined every niche and corner about the house and about the stable. We even pulled off boards to look in places wholly unlikely. Again we looked far up the maple trunk. The whole family was out by this time, and one keen eye looked farther still. There was wee Willie, not only very high up, but very far out, his little body waving in the wind far above our heads. Such a helpless speck he was, his balancing tail jerking from right to left, and the plaintive voice barely reaching us. We dared not call him, as he was going towards the drooping end of the limb, and was so perilously near the end that it was bending almost perpendicularly with his light weight. His weak little prayer for life was too much for us, however. Something must be done. So one of us bethought him of the housetop. The housetop was gained, which placed the rescuer behind and now nearly on a level. Then he began to call, and Kitty heard and heeded. Very carefully he turned himself about upon the slender limb, and crept tremblingly back to the great trunk. From there he was rescued, a hungry little pussy and a wiser one, for he was never caught in that predicament again. Willie developed one peculiarity. That was exclusiveness. He was a kitchen and a roof cat. Between these two places he was never known to tarry. There was an old-fashioned wooden pump in the kitchen, the top of which was just the size for a comfortable resting place for a curled-up cat. To reach this high point, the cat had first to land upon the stove, and from there leap to the pump. It apparently made no difference to him how hot the stove might be on baking day. 'Twas just the same. We sometimes looked for blisters on his feet, but his stay upon the hot surface was too short to harm him. He had another bed in the kitchen, a little old-time rocking-chair, well cushioned, but he oftener sought the pump, feeling himself well out of harm's way, and also very warm and comfortable. He was afraid of strangers to an unusual degree. An unfamiliar step at the door would always drive him hastily from chair to pump, if not already there upon his watchtower. In the course of time the pump had to be removed and was replaced by a newer make, much smaller and neater, but not at all satisfactory to the cat. He was as a sheep without a shepherd, a compassless mariner. An old uncle, a member of the family, took pity upon him and made a neat broad shelf. This was put exactly where the top of the pump had been, and Willie was more than content. The house was old and rambling, built at different times, with numerous stairways, out-of-the-way rooms, and passages. Grown partly over the wall and roof was an ivy, which was the happy home of innumerable English sparrows. Willie knew this, but the vine was at the opposite end of the house from the kitchen, and he had a great dread of venturing out of his own room. About once a day, however, he became very heroic, and made a dive through the long house, up the 2 flights of stairs, and out upon the roof. He usually descended in a short time with a sparrow, and that was all until the next day. The dusk of evening was his best time, when the sparrows were going to roost. Occasionally he would miss his footing, and come flouncing down in an undignified manner outside, dragging the vine with him. Except when on these mad hunts, he was never known, so far as I can remember, to stay his foot in any room but the kitchen. Even the dining-room adjoining, with the door frequently left open, was as a closed book to him, and this was not by training, but was inborn, we children many times doing our best to coax him into the living-rooms. But there came a sad change for Willie. We left the old house and moved to another part of the town. I took charge of the cat, carrying him closely covered that he might not remember the route, but unfortunately for him and us, he was one of the non-movable cats. We kept him in the cellar for about a week, and then allowed him his liberty. He accommodated himself to his new surroundings better than we had thought. Every evening he went out, but always returned, until one night, about 2 weeks after the moving, he stayed out much later than usual. We were uneasy, but at last he came, meowing at the window for admittance. We took the prodigal in, but the next night he did not return. He had found his old home, and there he was destined to stay. I brought him back again, but he knew the road home too well, and returned as soon as he was given his liberty. After that we visited him occasionally, but the old house had new occupants, and they thought the place overburdened with cats. There was a wholesale shooting, and we never saw or heard of Willie again. Alas for our pet! The innocent suffered with the guilty, for Willie was a model cat, the last one to interfere or give trouble in any way. He was about 13 years old at the time of his death, and had always kept to his happy kittenish ways. A stray piece of coal, or the upturned corner of a rug or carpet, was excuse enough for a fine frolic and somersault, even in his good old age. End of Chapter 13. Recording by Jessica Louise. Chapter 14 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Big Lill and Crabbedsie. Big Lill and his wife Crabbedsie lived their lives of weal and woe, of better and worse, more than 30 years ago. Big Lill was a splendid fellow, large, well-built, and beautiful, a tortoise-shell. Why he had to be branded with a female name is something I cannot say. No doubt he felt it keenly. There were 2 male cats in the family, and they were named respectively Big Lill and Little Lill. I only remember one accomplishment of the larger Lills, and that was the dexterity with which he mouthed and the rapidity with which he swallowed a full stream of milk coming directly from the cow's teat. He always knew when the milking time came, and the milkers took great delight in suddenly firing a stream at him, even when quite a distance off, but it usually found him ready to take it all in. Mrs. Big Lill, or Crabbedsie, was a very ordinary-looking cat, small, with a dull, mottled grey gown and a pug nose. But she had 2 prominent characteristics. One was her sour temper, the other her rat-catching ability. Even when not enjoying an outburst of rage, she was of a crabbed, complaining disposition. Notwithstanding this, she and her better half seemed to get along quite happily, and had it not been for a memorable ride which they were compelled to take, they might have continued to live contentedly together for many years. But the family had planned a moving, and the cats were put together in a barrel and placed upon a wagon. I suppose the exhibition of temper on the part of his good wife upon this occasion was more than Lill could stand, for soon after their arrival in their new home he left her. Poor Crabbedsie was heartbroken and became more morose than ever. Day after day she watched and waited for his return, but he came not. 3 months had sped away. Even the family had given up hopes of seeing him again, when Crabbedsie, sitting sunning herself on the long piazza, saw a familiar figure come bounding over the meadow and across the lawn. She could hardly believe her eyes, and her little heart went pit-a-pat. For once she forgot to be crabbed in the glad surprise and reunion. He stayed with her for a time, but the roaming spirit had taken a strong hold of him, and one morning not long after he was missing again. For years he led the same fickle, adventurous life, being away the greater part of the time, but never wholly forgetting his little spitfire of a wife. And so unhappy Crabbedsie never knew for long whether she was a wife or a widow. But there came a last time, and a time when his beautiful form was but a memory. His little neglected wife lived on for some years, never being able to entirely govern her natural disposition, but was so humoured and petted by her human friends that she had little cause for complaint. And when the time came to lay her away in the little cat-and-dog cemetery, there were moist eyes and hearts that were truly sad. For she was a brave little puss and a famous hunter. One morning we dropped her into a hogshead with 3 very sprightly rats. Soon all was quiet, and when we looked in, 1 dead rat lay upon the bottom, and 2 hung limp from their destroyer's mouth. Poor Crabbedzie's days of war are over. Very peacefully she sleeps 'neath her little green mound, cats and dogs together, all their jarring over, their active little limbs forever stilled. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sir Thomas Walcinda. A black cat happened in one day from no one knew where. Luck or fate led him among cat lovers. At first he hung around the stable and took a great fancy to the road that led to the front gate, spending much of his time rolling over and over and wriggling about among the rough cinders. Wallowing, as Mr. S. always put it, hence the cat's name. The friction, I suppose, was very agreeable and stimulating, and puss enjoyed it as we enjoy our salt rubs. Sir Thomas was also fond of carriage riding. Every time the buggy was drawn from the shed he would spring in and take his place upon the seat. There he would patiently wait while the horse was being harnessed, then take his ride to the front door, where they would be joined by Mrs. S., and from there another ride to the gate. That he well knew was the end of his journey, and he usually sprang out without waiting for an invitation. But occasionally a gentle tap was necessary, with a reminder of his home duties. Goodbye, Sir Tom. Go back and take care of dear old auntie. One day Sir Thomas felt very chilly. It was winter. He had been out in the storm. His black coat was very damp. He sought a quiet place in which to warm and dry himself, but it was cleaning day. Windows were open, and brushes and brooms were flying everywhere. In his distress he crept into the cellar, and seeing the large door at the base of the heater open, ventured in. It seemed warm and cozy there, and the ashes were almost as pleasant as the cinders. so he settled down and soon went off into a sound sleep. The next thing he knew, burning ashes were flying in his face and red-hot coals tumbling on his back. He was blinded and almost smothered. He tried to meow but could not. Mr. S., unconscious of the fact that he was doing a cruel deed, now closed the large door where Puss had entered, opened the small slide immediately above it, and was about to leave the cellar when he heard such a strange noise behind him. Looking back, he saw 2 ashy paws extended beseechingly from the small opening. With hasty strides he rushed back and opened the door, when poor Sir Tom dashed past him, almost crazy with pain. Up the stairs he went, startling the cleaners by his strange appearance and behavior. Mrs. S. gave chase with a dust-brush, and soon had the hot coals and ashes brushed from his back. And when he quieted down a little, Vaseline was applied to the burns, and poor Puss soon felt more comfortable. After this experience, Sir Thomas lived a happy, uneventful life for some years. But late one autumn he disappeared, and there was great distress in the household. There was seeking here and there, and many inquiries among the neighbours. A cat belonging nearby disappeared at the same time. She was a lovely Maltese. The owners condoled with each other, and wondered what had befallen their pets, but at length concluded to look upon the bright side. So after that they explained the disappearance by saying that Sir Thomas and Miss Malty had eloped, and probably had gone south to escape the cold winter. Then let us hope that Sir Thomas and Lady Walcinda are yet living happily in some southern home, where there is no need to creep into the treacherous furnaces for warmth and comfort. End of chapter 15. Recording by Jessica Louise. Chapter 16 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Benny. And what shall I say of him, the dearest love of my heart, the cat who has been and is so much to me? He and his brother came to us in their babyhood, 2 yellow balls in a grape basket, one with pink about his neck and the other with blue. Ben was named for the giver, and the other we christened Buff. On the basket was for Marion and Florence, 2 little cousins who lived side by side, but Florence was at the shore for the summer, so both kittens stayed with us. When Florence returned, Buff, who was her share, was the only one of the pair who inclined to go next door. It seemed almost as though he knew that he had the special right, and although he never made his home there, he was a frequent visitor. As the kittens grew, there came a change upon them. As near alike as pins in the first place, Ben soon developed into a broad-faced, high-tailed, robust cat. His fur became almost white about the mouth and on neck and breast. His nose was the daintiest pink, and he had as winning and intelligent an expression as ever rested upon the countenance of a cat. Buff had a peaked face, and was not so fair as his brother. His back curved up a trifle, and his tail drooped. The expression of face and figure being rather melancholy, lacked entirely the free, independent air of Benjamin. Nor was his disposition so affectionate or pleasing, although he was not afraid of strangers, as was Ben, and for that reason they who came to the house sometimes preferred Buff. We loved them both, of course, and the little girls would deck them in white caps and long baby dresses and have great fun. The kittens did not seriously object to this, and would sometimes go sound asleep in their baby attire. But all too soon there came a separation. Poor Buff met with a serious accident. He came to us one morn with his right front leg and foot badly crushed. Our hearts bled for him, and we did what we could. For days we nursed him, but he ate little and showed no signs of improvement. He must have suffered, but was quiet and patient to the last, and we loved him better in those days than we had ever done. His little image still comes up before me as he sat with patient, downcast face, holding up the maimed limb. We finally thought it better to give him rest. A few inhalations of the overpowering drug, and he settled down into a pussy-like attitude, with his poor, sore foot completely hidden, and soon all was over. He had his little funeral, and looked so peaceful in his soft-lined box with roses and honeysuckle beside him. The grass is now green upon the tiny mound beneath the low-limbed pear tree. The fragrant petals flutter down and dotted o'er with white, while many a bright bouquet, perhaps only of daisies and clover, finds its way to the little resting place. Ben missed his playfellows sadly, and we missed their gay gambolings on the green lawn. It was soon after that Benny had an unusual and exciting experience. From my room on the 3rd floor, a closet opened out under the sloping roof. This was unceiled, and largely without flooring. Ben was fond of going in here to hunt for mice and sparrows. He had always returned safely, so on this memorable morning I allowed him to slip in as usual. After a time I missed the slight noises in the closet and began to wonder what had happened to our Benjamin. Opening wide the door, I called him. Away, far away, I heard a faint, beseeching answer. Then I knew that he must have either fallen or crept down between the wall and the inner linings of the house. I continued to call and soon heard him a little higher up, but at the entirely opposite side of the house. Then I went from my room through the hall to the staircase which touched the other wall. Here he sounded quite near, but there being no opening on that side, nothing could be done. I had called Mrs. B, so we put our heads together and decided to return to the closet and renew our efforts there. At length he got back, but he had been entirely around the house, and so came to the closet from the opposite direction. This end was well boarded, but one crack was wide enough to allow a dirty little yellow paw to squeeze through, and to afford us glimpses of a large-eyed, frightened, longing face. Then we got out of his sight, so that he might go away again and possibly come back at a wider opening. 3 times he came back, at different places, looking more discouraged and pitiful each time. At last we despaired, and went for men and tools to cut him a way out, but just as we reached the closet and they were tramping up the stairs, I saw a dusty yellow body, squeezing and wriggling itself out of the only opening wide enough for poor pussy's body, and there was a glad Benny and a glad, glad family. He made love to us, and we made love to him, but he was so tired. We gave him a saucer of milk, and then, having found a patch of sunshine, he stretched himself out full length and slept and slept and slept. That was in his early youth. He is in the prime of his cathood now, a handsome, sprightly fellow and an untiring, successful hunter, one of the most brilliant ratters I've ever known. When little more than a kitten, he would tug in rat after rat for the approval of the family. He is an ardent lover of his human friends, but very sensitive to any slight or show of indifference, never dropping his love seeds in barren soil or wasting his sweetness on the desert air. Benny is my best and dearest model, a fine poser and a good art critic. He has carefully inspected a large number of the sketches which go towards filling quite a sizable box, my cat portfolio. Now for Benny's failings. He has them. How he delights in chewing and destroying the dainty little ferns which we so love to have in our windows and on our tables. He also has a mania for pins. We call him our champion pin-eater. Pin after pin is pulled from the cushion, chewed viciously, then dropped to floor or table. When the cushion has been shorn, he takes up with the scissors, daintily hooking them up with a claw, then dangling them about for a minute and dropping them. This is often repeated several times. The rattle and glitter seem to amuse him greatly, but the pin-eating habit fills us with dread, lest some time one should go wrong and become embedded in poor Benny's tender interior. He loves to roam around and around the evening lamp, first in one person's light, and then in another's. He will sit down for a moment and look at one as if he thought he was conferring a special favor by excluding the light. He takes an active interest in the sewing, the games, the reading, and all that goes on around the evening light. Sometimes he is requested to move on, or assisted to descend from the table. I put him to bed about 9 o'clock every evening. Some old chairs are piled up in one corner of the heater cellar. The top one, which is turned bottom side up, he chose for a bed. We afterwards gave him a piece of lambskin to add to his comfort. If not called by some member of the family, he very often sleeps quite late in the morning. I usually give him a tidbit at bedtime, and he always has this on his mind during the evening. If I stir or move ever so little from the table, he has his eyes upon me, and is quite ready to make for the cellar door in bed, with such a reward in view. Benny is fond of sitting in a little high chair at the dining table, and unless very hungry does not beg for the food. But if a knife, fork, or spoon be near him, and he happens to be in a playful mood, there is a lively time of it for a while, and usually a precipitous descent from the high chair. His mistress says that she has known him to slip off with eatables that he would turn up his nose at if presented to him in an open manner. This surely is a bad trait, his worst, I believe, but fortunately it is not a settled habit. A lady came to the house one day when meat was very high in price, and seeing some choice bits of steak going down Benny's Red Lane, remarked, "Surely, Mrs. B., you do not give such meat as that to the cat." "Yes," answered she, "what we have, Benny has, if he wants it." We must leave Benny now. He's probably curled up in his summer bed among the flowers. When I last saw him, he came hurrying to me from among the nasturtiums, his yellow coat filled with their spicy odor, and his face alight with love and welcome. End of chapter 16. Recording by Jessica Louise. Chapter 17 of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mission of the Cat. Part 1. The Child, the Man, the Woman, the Aged One. The Child. The child leaned upon his crutches and looked through the rain-splashed window into the street. His lips were trembling, his eyes brimming over. There was no sunshine for him that morning, neither within nor without. He gazed vacantly, scarcely seeing, when suddenly a cat sprang up before him on the sill. Spattered and ruffled with the storm, thin and ugly by nature, and lame. The boy saw it all in a glance, and his heart went out to it in sympathy. He raised the sash a few inches, and the cat slipped in, very glad indeed to find shelter and a friendly hand. A cloth was found, and pussy was wiped off, while he purred and wriggled his thanks. The boy had no brothers or sisters, and his mother was away at her daily work. Ever since the invalid husband and father had been taken from them, this had seemed necessary. So the mother spread the table for him each day before she left. Eatables were placed nearby, and everything arranged for his comfort. But this day he had felt so very much alone, his brave little heart had failed him. Now, pussy had come, and all was changed. He hobbled to the cupboard, the cat by his side, and poured some milk into a saucer. This was eagerly lapped up. "Meow," said the cat. "More?" said the boy. So the cat was fed until he had forgotten that he had ever been hungry. Then he crept to the mat by the little stove, tucked his nose into his fur, and was soon away in dreamland, only now and then disturbed by a thin little hand slipping gently over his weather-beaten coat. The boy was happy now, and when the mother came she glanced in at the window and saw the two curled up together in his big armchair, both sound asleep. The child awoke as she entered, and hugged the cat close to him. "Oh, mother!" But she saw the question in his eyes. She looked at the ugly cat and thought of the extra mouth to fill when it was all so very hard. She hesitated, then stooped and kissed the eager lips, putting her mother arms about the two, the boy and the cat. Years passed. The boy grew better, and in time quite well. The cat remained the same, thin and ugly, although well fed, and lame all the days of his life. Many a passer-by and chance visitor wondered why they kept such a cat, and why the young man always seemed so fond of it. The man went into the business world and was successful, and after years became wealthy. The cat lived to a good old age, and died a natural death, nursed and tended to the last by the hands best loved. The wealthy man left much money to charities, but while he lived he founded and personally superintended a home and hospital for cat foundlings, for strays, for the sick and injured. The man. A businessman, through unlooked-for reverses, found himself comparatively poor. The woman whom he had hoped to make his wife, although loving him in her weak way, could in no way be expected to face adversity, so the ring was slipped from her finger and she was free. The man had been a country boy. One morning he awoke filled with a desire to get away, far away from the din of the great city, from the gaze of his fellow man. The green fields and the trees came up before him, and that was all. Without a word he stepped into the street and wandered forth, but as he walked, stooped and took up a fragile, bedraggled kitten from its tormentors at a street corner. taking it with him. Block after block, mile after mile, until he felt the soft, cool sod beneath his feet and the woodland shadows upon his path. He had no thought of hunger, but the kitten which had been asleep on his bosom was now crying loudly. It must be fed. So they stopped at a small, time-worn home by the roadside and asked for milk and bread, giving a few pennies in return. Then again they travelled on. Grown weary at last, they rested beneath a pine tree, and the man slept soundly, awaking with naught on his mind but the peace and quiet of the wood and the care of his little companion, who soon put in its bright good morning and clambered to his shoulder. Here they stayed day after day, getting their simple food at a small cot by the way. The family eyed the man curiously at first, but soon became accustomed to the daily visits. Uneducated and poor, they seldom saw the daily papers, and if they had, might easily have overlooked the heading, "A Prominent Citizen Missing." The kitten's little sides plumped out, and it became playful and affectionate. The man would sit and watch it romping with the leaves and twigs, or would lie down and let it scramble and tumble over him. It was the link which bound him to life and love. One morning the man opened his eyes with a new light within them. There was a change upon his face. He arose quickly, a purpose in every movement. "I shall go back," he said. "I shall begin anew." The man was better. The trees had ministered unto him. The pure air and the blue sky, the solitude broken only by the bright voices of the birds and the plaintive cries of his little companion. So they journeyed home, he and the kitten. The man's friends received him with welcoming arms. They aided him, and again he became the successful man. Years have now passed. Business cares are largely over. The man sits in his comfortable chair by the open fire. A faithful wife is beside him. They are talking in quiet tones. Above the mantel hangs a life-size painting of a cat. It is a faithful portrait, and the man's eyes are resting upon it. The woman. She reclined in her cozy corner, absently drawing strands from a bit of fine linen in her hand. Occasionally she looked up, and her eyes rested upon one after another of the beautiful and costly things about the room. She glanced out of the open window and saw the velvet grass, the shrubbery, and beds of brilliant and delicate flowers, and she loved these things, and it was reflected upon her face. But the woman was not happy. Discontent and sadness settled down upon her. She remembered the 2 little graves in the great cemetery. How very small they were, and yet how many hopes and joys lay buried there. A man, the best of husbands, came into the room. He stepped to her side and stood smiling down upon her, and she said to him, "I should so like to have a pet, something alive." A few days after, a bright-eyed bird in a gilded cage came to the home, and he sang and was very sweet and very knowing, and soon was allowed the liberty of the room, and would flit from fern to palm, from palm to flower, always happy, always alert. Months went by, and the woman wooed and wooed her bright birdie, but never once would he rest upon her finger or allow her gentle hand to touch him, and she was dissatisfied, and said to her husband, "How I long for something I can caress, something I can take into my arms. I should love to have a kitten." And the woman awoke one morning from a dream. It was the anniversary of her birth. The husband was standing by the window. "I had a dream," she said. "I dreamed there was a mother cat at the door holding a kitten in her mouth. I opened the door, and she followed me in, and laid the kitten at my feet, and then she looked up into my face and meowed." He turned and looked at her with a peculiar smile. "What a silly dream," he said, and left the room. An hour later they met in the breakfast-room. Upon her chair was a basket with a closed lid. "Oh," says she, "'tis my birthday." And she lifted the lid. Within lay a fluffy white kitten. It roused from its light slumber, looked up at her with round blue baby eyes, then opened its small pink mouth in a plaintive meow. The woman's eyes glistened. She took the soft little thing into her hands, and pressed it to her cheek. Then she turned to her husband. The Aged One. An old woman sat in her easy-chair, alone in the room but for the cat which purred upon her lap. She was hard of hearing, and her eyes were so dim she could not read. Even her knitting had been laid aside months ago, as her hands stiffened with rheumatism. Her children and her children's children were about her, and they were kind to her, but their lives were very full. Home, business, and social duties crowded upon each other, and poor Grandma was often left very much alone. Had it not been for the great grey cat, she would have been miserable indeed. But Pussy loved the dear old lap where he was always welcome, and he loved the little bits of eatables which she always shared with him. He would lie at length upon her lap, stretch his paws upon her bosom, and with half-sleepy eyes look up into her face as if to say, "You dear old soul, you're so kind to me, I shall never forsake you." One day Grandma was left longer than usual, and when they came into the room her head was drooped, as if in sleep. But it was the last, long, sweet sleep. The cat, true to his promise, lay curled upon her lap, and her poor stiff hands were still about him in that last caress. Part 2. Morning on the Farm. Farmer Turnsoil. "Marthy Ann, my patience is clean worn out with them rats and mice. I can't find a bag without a hole or two in it, and the thrashers are comin' tomorrow, and this mornin' I found the meal strewed all over the granary floor. We must get a cat." Enter Miss Turnsoil. "Mamma, you know that beautiful pincushion that Sally Grubb gave me? She must have stuffed it with bran, for this morning I wondered what was scattered all over my bureau and floor, and then I saw such a big ugly hole in my cushion. I hate mice, and we must get a cat." Enter Tommy Turnsoil. "I've lost my new penknife. There's a great hole in my pocket. It must have been a mouse, for I remember putting a hunk of gingerbread in my pocket, and I suppose left some crumbs. If only we had a cat." Mrs. Turnsoil. "Yes, I don't like cats, but we can stand it no longer. This morning I saw something dark in the cream jar, and I fished out a mouse. It is churning day, too, and the jar was full of cream. That means no butter for half a week. I shall start right after dinner and not return until I have found at least one cat to bring home with me." End of chapter 17. Recording by Jessica Louise. End of Cats by the Way by Sarah E. Trueblood.